So today we're going to talk about the results of the Korean War. So these are notes 4.4. It is the second set of notes for Unit 4, Part 2 of your study guide. Now, each of these sets of notes is set up kind of like a chart. So we're going to look at some of the different countries that were involved in the war, and you'll want to think about what we talk about in class as well. Remember I said we did the part of the war, the actual war itself in class. And so we're looking at the different countries that are involved in the war and their gains and losses during or at the end of the Korean War. So we'll start by looking at Korea and its gains and losses. So first of all, Korea gains essentially nothing. No good really comes to Korea out of this. The entire war is fought on the peninsula of Korea in both North and South Korea. There are many dead, there are many wounded. As we look at the losses side, casualties, 1.3 million South Koreans, over 500,000 North Koreans, and over 3 million civilians on both sides. So you're really looking at devastation. As you can see in this picture, just absolute devastation for the people who live in Korea. Much of the industry is destroyed, agriculture, you have people who are homeless. Again, if you just look at that picture, you can really see that and it illustrates it. So for Korea, they don't get their goal of uniting into one country, one Korea. Each of them remains a separate country. The U.S. continues to back the capitalist democratic government in the South. The Soviets, and especially the Chinese, continue to back the communist government in the North. And really, Korea has no gains, no wins, and everything that comes out of this for them is not good. The second place, I guess we'll call it, that we'll look at is the United Nations. So which is kind of interesting because it's not really a place, but they had a very important role in the Korean War. So we're going to look at them. The gains of the United Nations gained respect. So the prompt action they had gained respect of the world. This is really their first kind of test for the United Nations. They had never been involved in something like this before. And it was joint action by the members. So the members of the United Nations really came together to gain respect, to act quickly, and to do what the people wanted. However, there are 17,000 casualties from the United Nations troops. And really, it's about the USA, not the United Nations. So as far as losses go, the United Nations could be seen as very weak and really under the control of the US, not a group effort. So now we get to look at the United States, since we just talked about them. So in the United States, we saved South Korea from communism, which means that containment worked in Asia. So you can really talk about that whole, remember, containment was the big umbrella policy and we have smaller policies underneath it. But as far as our gains and our successes, South Korea remains capitalist. Containment worked for us. We did not allow it to spread into South Korea. And as a side note, one that we'll talk about more later, but was important, the military was actually desegregated by Truman during the Korean War. So in class, we actually mentioned, so in World War II, that there were still segregated military units. You had the Tuskegee Airmen and some things like that. Well, in the 1950s, Truman says there's no reason for that and actually makes, by executive order, by Truman's decision, he stops segregation in the military. And from the Korean War on, there is no more segregation in the military, even though desegregation does not happen in the general American public until much later. Now, on the loss side or the con side for the United States, 142,000 casualties, sorry about that, $60 billion in defense spending, up from $12 billion. We multiplied our spending on defense by 5. This is where defense spending in the U.S. really gets high. So today we have really high defense spending. We really started in the Cold War. The Korean War, we see it astronomically grow. And remember, the war is really only 2 years long. So it makes a huge difference that we don't get that we need to spend that much money. And we fail to free North Korea. So North Korea remains communist. And we can see that a lot of what is happening in North Korea today can be traced back to the Korean War. So we end up with North Korea as communist, South Korea as capitalist. Here we see the 38th parallel. That's what this is here. And you can see, if I take us back to the pen, right here, it kind of waves, the armistice line and what is today the border between North and South Korea. So we can really start to see how this war impacts today and what's happening today in Korea and in Asia. So our next country to look at is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, they actually gain a closer friendship with China and become allies with China because of the Korean War. So because China is now communist, they're willing to fight and support other communist nations. The Soviet Union actually gains an ally in Asia that they didn't have before. The US loses that ally. Unfortunately for them, their loss, a very expensive arms race with the United States, trying to build up more and more weapons than the US. The US is trying to build up more weapons, so then the Soviets try to. And we talked about this with the atomic bomb in class, where you don't want the other side to have more, better weapons. So you want that. So if they get something new, you get 2 new things. And if you get 2 new things, they get 3 new things. And then you get 4 new things. And so they just keep going back and forth. And that's your arms race, building up these stockpiles of weapons to try to beat the other side. And here, just to give you kind of an idea, so this is the number of warheads that the US and the Soviets have during these time periods. So we go from 45, which is when World War II ended, to 2005. And the time period we're really looking at goes from the end of World War II up to right between 85 and 95, right around 1990. So if we kind of look at that, I'm probably going a little crooked there. I think I went a little bit crooked, but you get the idea. Look at the increase in US stockpiles of weapons in the beginning of the 50s. Right during the Korean War, right after the Korean War, look how much we have more weapons. Look how many more weapons we have when we're not at war, late 40s and into the 50s, than we had when we ended World War II. And then look at Russia's, or the Soviet Union's back here. Steady increase over time. And apparently it didn't like my line. So we can really see this arms race happening. Then we want to look at China and their successes. So their gains, respect of Asian communism. So they were willing to help. Saved North Korea from America, allowed North Korea to be communist and to be independent. America, the evil America, wasn't going to take them over. Kept a buffer state. Remember we talked about the satellite nations for the Soviet Union? Well, China wants those as well, and this is one of them. North Korea is a buffer state for China. And closer friendship with the Soviet Union is also going to help China, because the Soviet Union at this time is one of the top countries in the world. It's a superpower. But they had almost 1 million casualties. Very high cost, and they're a poor country that just went through their own civil war. 1949 was the Chinese Civil War. 1951 is the beginning of the Korean War. So as we look at that, they really had no time to recover in there. They failed to win South Korea for communism or for just being an independent Korea. They increased American protection of Taiwan, and remember that is where the Chinese government that is exiled is at, and the ones that the US is recognizing as the government. And isolated in trade and politics from America, or by America. So for a long time, we don't trade much with China. We are very separated from them, and a lot of that goes back to the Korean War, which is economically going to hurt China, and so going to hurt their development. So you can see here, we've now got the Soviet Union, we've got China, we have North Korea. You can see that this is kind of a big communist bloc. We also, more and more of those areas will fall to communism as we start looking at Asia here as we move through the rest of this unit and really into the next unit as well. So you want to make sure you look at your study guide. Remember I said this is Unit 4, Part 2, and you're using these notes and using the study guide to make sure you're ready for the quiz and for the unit test.